So this is going to be our theme image on our slides. Anybody know what we're looking at here? It's a Xerox on a raw egg. And it leads me to ask this question, why aren't we Xeroxing our automobiles? So we'll sort of unfold that as we go through the course. Let me get my laser pointer. Well, let's skip that for a moment. So I mentioned that I work on Timeship, and it's going to be a $300 million building to store 50,000 frozen people that you froze in cryonics, you're frozen after you're dead. So they've got to be able to they got to be able to thaw you out and fix you. So there's absolutely no way to even think about doing that today, but we'll see what we think of technological development and if it might be possible in the future. So those are the kind of things we're going to be looking at. And also we can talk about re-engineering the universe. Does anybody know what a Dyson sphere is?
Yeah.
Tell us, what's a Dyson sphere?
Basically, we can utilize the energy from the sun by creating a Dyson sphere.
What is
basically, you can imagine the multiple, like millions of solar panels surround the entire sphere of the sun. So we don't even need the sun. We just utilize the energy from it.
Right.
So we can use, basically a civilization can utilize the entire energy of a star.
Right. So if you think about it, here's the sun, and way 93 million miles away is this tiny little speck, the Earth. So 99.9999% of the sun's energy gets not to the Earth, gets lost. And we capture this tiny little sliver and try to run our planet on this solar energy. Well, what if you made a sphere the size of the Earth's orbit, totally surrounding the sun? You could capture all the energy. You'd have 100 trillion times more energy. Well, how would you do that? Well, you dismantle the planet Jupiter and you use its material to build this big sphere. That's how people are thinking that we'll look at in this course. So this is, sometime we'll do a fly through. We've totally built this in a gaming engine. So it exists in 3D, but not in reality. Now, we're going to talk about something called the singularity. Anybody tell me what the singularity is? Has a floating definition. Singularity is an event outside of physics, so that a black hole is a singularity, and the universe was a singularity before the Big Bang. But term is used to mean, okay, we see down here let me get my laser pointer. We see an exponential curve. We're going to talk a lot about exponential growth. And if the rate of technological development keeps accelerating, pretty soon it'll be, so let's say Wikipedia doubles every 2 years. What happens when it's doubling every 10 minutes? How do we deal with that? So the singularity is when the rate of technological development gets beyond what we can comprehend. Another definition is it's the point where artificial intelligence exceeds human intelligence. And we'll talk about where you can plot when that'll be happening. So a big proponent of this is Ray Kurzweil, who pretty bright guy. He developed a Moog synthesizer. So if you have like a Casio keyboard, that's his technology. The flatbed scanner, that's his technology. And his book after this book was How to Create a Mind on artificial intelligence. And I'm not a big fan of artificial intelligence, but that's a really great book. But given that he's into developing artificial intelligence, does anybody know what his current position is and why it could be really scary? Who's got more computing capability than anybody else? Two choices. Google and Amazon. Well, Ray Kurzweil is now chief scientist at Google. And God knows what he's doing with those resources. So when we talk about this growth, we can say, when will there be more circuitry in a single computer chip than there is in the human brain? Well, you can plot it. For 100 years, we've had what's called Moore's Law, which we'll talk about that more specifically, but very generally, computing capability doubles every 2 years. And that's been going on for 100 years. So if we start with the mechanical relays that the phone company was using in 1900 up to the current Intel Xeon chips, which are now being exceeded by Apple's new M1 chips, it's been pretty constant. Now, this is a logarithmic curve. In other words, going from here to here, we didn't increase 10, we increased 100-fold. So every one of these jumps is a 100-fold increase. So this, if this was not a logarithmic curve, it would go off the paper, just be going straight up. Look like this. So we take these exponential curves and express them logarithmically so that they'll stay on the paper. So singularity means the pace of change is accelerating. It's got a lot of meanings. Point at which the pace of change exceeds our ability to handle it. Point at which the exponential curve is going almost straight up. Imagine if computers doubled in capability every week. You're going to buy a new computer every week? No, your phone logs into the cloud. You can keep your phone, but what you're logging into when you go to Wikipedia or you go to iTunes or you go to Facebook can be doubling every week, even though you don't have to buy a new phone. It can mean the point at which artificial intelligence exceeds human intelligence, and it can mean the new sphere, the end point of the evolution of the universe when humanity becomes one with the cosmos. So here, this technology gets mystical. And a lot of these technologists are, on this level, mystical. We'll talk about computation, define what it is. So there's a lot of issues to look at. First of all is the growth in computer power. So here is ENIAC, and it was right across the walkway from the architecture school where I was studying. It was no longer in use, but it was there. And I didn't know about this stuff when I was an architecture student, so I never went to see it. But this is a supercomputer from 10 years ago, a Cray XT5 Jaguar. And it's, if this is, let me get my, I can't read what we got here because it's hidden. So let me get this out of the way. So the ENIAC could do 5,000 operations per second. This Cray can do 2.3 petaflops, which is 23,000 trillion operations. I mean, I can't even handle the numbers. But then we discover that this is like 10 years old, 2.3 petaflops. Now we're up to 415 petaflops. And that's already last year. So growth of computer power, it's growing. Next issue is new computer architectures. So our computers are Turing machines, and they use what's called von Neumann architecture: input, processing, memory, output. But Neil Gershenfeld at the Media Lab in the architecture school at MIT, where the cool stuff at MIT goes on in the Media Lab in the architecture school, what he has called the Center for Bits and Atoms, is working on totally new computer architecture. So think about it. You do input into your computer. It does the processing. It goes to the printer, and the printer puts the ink on the paper. What if the whole thing was done in the paper? We are computing. We have instructions in our DNA, which is reproducing, dividing cells, and it's also manufacturing new cells. It's telling us what to do. That computing is not coming from outside telling us what to do. We do it ourselves. So what if the computing is in the material rather than in an external machine? That's totally new computer architecture that he's working on. Other kinds of computing, like DNA computing, we can use DNA is really massively effective storage capability and computing capability. And we're just beginning to think about how to harness it. Artificial intelligence. We'll talk a little bit about that. And when I was in college, in architecture school, I had a roommate who was studying artificial intelligence. And he wasn't too bright. I never thought that much of artificial intelligence. And we were always being told it's 20 years off. And we were told that for 50 years. But now something's starting to happen. So let me just grab this link. And copy this. And I'm going to need you to raise your hand if you can hear what we're about to hear. Let me get a new window. Let me.
As I said earlier, our vision for our system is to help you get things done. It turns
How many people
out
can hear?
A big part of getting things done is making a phone call. You may want to get an oil change schedule, maybe call a plumber in the middle of the week, or even schedule a haircut appointment. We think AI can help with this problem. So let's go back to this example. Let's say you want to ask Google to make you a haircut appointment on Tuesday between 10 and noon. What happens is the Google Assistant makes the call seamlessly in the background for you. So what you're going to hear is the Google Assistant actually calling a real salon to schedule the appointment for you. Let's listen.
How can I help you? Hi, I'm calling to book a woman's haircut for a client. I'm looking for something on May 3rd. Sure, give me 1 second. Sure, what time are you looking for around? At 12 p.m. We do not have a 12 p.m. available. The closest we have to that is a 1:15. Do you have anything between 10 a.m. and 12 p.m.? Depending on what service she would like. What service is she looking for? Just a woman's haircut for now? Okay, we have a 10 o'clock. 10 a.m. is fine. Okay, what's her first name? The first name is Lisa. Okay, perfect. So I will see Lisa at 10 o'clock on May 3rd. Okay, great. Thanks. Great. Have a great day. Bye.
Okay, so what you just heard, the person at the hair salon taking the appointment was a real person. The person making the appointment was artificial intelligence. And it seemed to work pretty well. Scary, right? So maybe we'll need less and less secretaries. So let's go back to share screen. And that's already 2 years ago. Cloud computing. So we don't need the power in our laptop or phone. We reach out to, so I started a online service for a company in the 90s, and it was before the web hit. The internet existed, but not the web. So when we say internet, we usually mean the web. It didn't exist. So we used bulletin board software. We had everything. We had an office space on 14th Street. We had everything in the office. We had Cisco routers, servers, which were just basically PCs. And we spent about $100,000 of our clients' money on this equipment. Today, all you need is a laptop, because you get a service provider to provide the service, to provide the servers. And if you're a big organization, the biggest service provider is Amazon. What happened was Amazon had to install a lot of computers so that they could handle Christmas shopping. But then for the rest of the year, 90% of the computers are not being used. And they said, wait a minute, we can sell services to other people. So suddenly they became a cloud provider. So Microsoft, Amazon, IBM, and Google all provide these services. So a company that's building out capability doesn't get their own servers. They use one of these servers. And Amazon's by far the biggest. And that's where they make most of their money. Their prices are so low on their store, they don't make very much money. But they make a fortune on their online services. So we don't have to have the power in our laptop. It can be elsewhere. Oh, and there are now companies setting up quantum computing services, and you can just log into them and do quantum computing, which, so quantum computing, basically, imagine you have a phone book with 1 million names and numbers, and you want to look up John Lobel's phone number. And his phone book is not in alphabetical order. So what you need to do is your cursor has to look at every name till it hits John Lobel. On average, it'll have to go 500,000 times before it finds a given number. Well, in quantum theory, a particle can be in lots of places at the same time. We'll talk about what that means. So basically, and rather than doing 500,000 hits to find John Lobel on average, you can do it in one hit. So your computer is 500,000 times faster. So a very capable quantum computer, which may or may not be possible, they're working on it, would be more powerful than if the entire universe was a computer, a classical computer. And that's just starting to happen. One of the problems with computers is they use a lot of energy. Like when a big Google or Amazon or Apple will build a building the size of an aircraft hangar and put 100,000 computers in there, servers, which is basically a desktop. And they use so much power that they locate them near rivers so they can run water through there to cool the place. And they use as much power as a small town. Well, Apple's new chip uses 1/4 the power of Intel chips. So Intel's in big trouble because Apple developed this chip for phones, which have to use much less power because you don't plug them in. Well, what happens when you make computers so small they go in the bloodstream? Talk about that in a minute. You have very tiny computers to power these little machines that are going to go in your bloodstream, become part of your body. But if they're doing a lot of computing, they make a lot of heat. Well, there's something called a Fredkin gate, which does computing using no energy. We'll talk about what that is, but it's really cool. Some people are thinking on large scale beyond Dyson spheres. There's a way we can understand, and we'll talk about this when we talk about computational theory, that physics is computation. Nature computes. There's something called it from bit, how the material world comes about through a yes-no bit binary process. Some of these people, like Seth Lloyd, thinks the universe, its software isn't quite right. Think of our DNA. Is it optimal? Our DNA is just what happened over billions of years. But there could be stuff in there that we don't need, stuff that could be done better. So eventually we want to reprogram our DNA. Well, Seth Lloyd's talking about reprogramming the universe. And finally, human-computer interface. So we start with punch cards. When I was in school, you had a card about the size of 2 credit cards. And you punch holes in it, and that's the information that's fed into the computer. Then we got a keyboard. Then we got a mouse and menus. So we now have that. It was developed by now the name's slipping my mind. but it was perfected at Xerox PARC. Xerox PARC did the whole thing. They had the GUI, graphical user interface, the mouse, the local area network, the laser printer, and Steve Jobs stole it all, which became the Macintosh, and Windows is just an imitation of the Mac. But we're still using that even on our phones. What about, we'll just put the chips right in your brain? So we're getting there. Well, before that, it'll be in contact lens. Information and networking. So we'll talk about information theory. Claude Shannon developed it. Shannon did two interesting things. One is for his master's thesis, in Boolean algebra, you say, if A is true and B is true, you get C. If A is true and B is not true, you get D. If A is true, A is not true, and B is not true, you get E. So that's Boolean logic. It was worked out in the late 1800s. And what Shannon did is says, you know what? Switches could do that. If two switches are open, you get an electrical circuit. If one is open and one's closed, you still get an electrical circuit. If both are closed, you don't get an electrical circuit. So you can have switches do Boolean logic. That's exactly what a computer chip is. Switching doing Boolean logic. Yes, no. So it's now called the most influential and most important master's thesis of all time. Nobody knew it at the time. And then when he was at Bell Labs, he said, how much information can you get through a telephone wire? At the time, it was called twisted pairs. So if you and I were on the phone together, there would be two pieces of copper going from my phone to you, no matter where you were. It would be going through here, through there, through switches, through phone line, but the electrons were going from my phone to your phone through two pieces of wire. It works differently today. But how much information can you get through two pieces of wire? What is information? How do you measure it? He worked all that out in a paper in 1947. And that's the foundations of what's called information theory. Information goes through channels. So let me get this so I can see what we're doing here. I just described twisted pairs, phone wires. You could get 50,000, 60,000 bits of information per second could go through phone wires. Then we got coaxial cables. Let's go down here. We have that for our cable TV, 648 million bits per second. And then fiber, laser fiber optic, 100 billion bits per second. Now this is very old. I was using this slide in 1969, but still applies today. But the point is, it's increasing. So we're going from this, these are phone wires strung all around, to our cell phones today. Everything connected to everything all the time. So we're getting to sensors. So I'll give you an example when we get there later, but my creativity book, which I'll send you later, I have it on my phone as Kindle. So you can get ebooks and Kindle. So I'm reading my book, I'm looking at it, and some of it's underlined. What the hell is that? So I look it up. Oh my God. When other readers underline parts of my book, it shows up on my phone. It's like, I don't like that. I don't want other people knowing what I'm doing. But we're even ways we don't realize we're all interconnected. All those cookies that every website is putting on your laptop follow what you're doing. search. So we go to Google and we're really impressed with what Google does. But search is in its infancy. It's just a few years old. God knows what it'll be doing in 10 years. And this down below here is Stephen Wolfram. We'll talk a lot about him in this course. This is Wolfram's Alpha, which is his search engine. So if you say, what is the population of France in Google? It's actually getting better, but just a few years ago, it would find an article that has France and population in it. And hopefully you'll find what you want. But if you say to Wolfram Alpha, what's the population of France as a proportion of the population of the United States? It looks up the population of the US, looks up the population of France, does the math, and gives you the answer. So that's a whole other level in which the search engine is doing the computation. But beyond that, who can tell me what is Google's secret sauce? What did Google do that was unique that it suddenly became one of the 3 biggest companies in the world? Anybody? What's different about how they search?
Algorithm?
Yeah, and what's the algorithm?
They always can measure what kind of stuff you like most, and according to your suggestion.
Well, that's true. In other words, if I look up, I start typing Stephen, it's going to give me Stephen Wolfram. But if you're into rock music, it'll give you something else, and it knows that. But beyond that, here's what happened. There were many search engines before Google. Yahoo was the biggest. And what Yahoo did was, let's say I'm searching for shoes. I'm going to search shoes. So I put shoes in Yahoo, and this is 30 years ago. It looks for websites that have shoes in their name or text. I've got a cat here bugging me. And but it doesn't know, do I want to write a research paper about shoes? Do I want to buy shoes? It has no idea. It's just giving me websites that talk about shoes. Now, people selling shoes figured that out, and they said, the website that has shoes 10 times will come up sooner, higher in the search than one with it 1 time. So everybody started putting below where you could see shoes 10 times. So someone put in shoes 100 times. So someone put in shoes 1,000 times. What Google did was say, of the websites that candidate websites for shoes, how many other websites link to them? And if more websites link to them, they must be an important website. And we'll make that one come up first. Now, which websites link to them? The websites that link to them that more other websites link to will weight their importance more. So what happened was Google is not finding a thing, shoes 100 times. It's finding relationships. It's giving you websites that other websites link to. So that's the secret sauce. That's it's called page mark after Larry Page, who invented it. So let's go back to share. So we are networked in ways we're not even aware of, like what I just said about my when I'm looking at my book, it's underlined from other people underlining. God knows what else they're doing. But figure everything we do, somebody's keeping track of. Now, information goes further. There now, it's broadly thought that information is the fundamental substance of the universe. It's not made out of electrons and protons. It's not made out of quarks. All those are derivative. The fundamental substance of the universe is information. The person who put that forward is John Archibald Wheeler, and his theory is called it from bit. In other words, stuff comes from it, comes from bit, a bit of information. So we'll talk about that. Molecular nanotechnology. How do we make stuff? So some years back, I forget the year, when we get to it, we'll have the year. But this is K. Eric Drexler, and he wrote a book, Engines of Creation. And in it, he proposed an idea that was first breached by everybody's favorite physicist. What's his name? It'll come to me. But the idea, this is a roller bearing, and each of these spheres is an individual atom. So what happens when we can make things out of individual atoms? And that's called nanotechnology. Once you can do that, you're never going to run out of atoms. There's plenty of them. And you can make extremely precise, efficient machines. So the idea was first put forward by Richard Feynman in an essay called There's Plenty of Room at the Bottom, meaning there's an infinite amount of stuff when we start using atoms. So the dream was, and it seems pretty far off, but there are other ways of getting there, that everybody would have in their homes something the size of a microwave. You would have feedstock, carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, and you'd have machinery in here, very tiny, lots of them, that will assemble stuff out of individual atoms. So you want a diamond ring? You keyboard in diamond ring, go out to dinner, come back, open your microwave, and there's a diamond ring. You want a T-bone steak? You key in T-bone steak. You don't have to go out to dinner. It'll assemble a T-bone steak. You can make anything as long as it's made out of atoms. So that's molecular nanotechnology. And there's a little video showing how this works where they make a 1 billion processor laptop. And this is being explored for medical nanotechnology. What happens when we can make these little robots that go in the bloodstream and can treat individual cells, go in there and destroy cancer cells, go in there and fix other cells, etc. So two of the leading nanotechnologists, Robert Freitas and Ralph Merkel, are working on all this stuff. And they're building those little assemblers that can pick up individual atoms. New materials. So carbon nanotubes. So some years back, we discovered buckyballs, which is a sphere, looks like a soccer ball. At each intersection of the pattern is a carbon atom. I think there's 60 carbon atoms in a buckyball. And then we realized you can unfold them We can make tubes out of them, which are very strong, thousands of times stronger than steel, and you make cables out of them. And you can make sheets of them. And the sheets are called graphene, which are, again, thousands of times stronger than steel. And you can make automobile bodies out of this. So those are coming. Isolating and manipulating single particles to, within there, get a single atom and play with its spin so that we can do the off-on of a computer as opposed to a transistor on a silicon chip. We can now get 14 billion transistors on a chip the size of your thumbnail in our phones, but they can get far smaller when that transistor is a single atom. And they're working on that. Quantum dots, that's when we force atoms into confined space and they behave differently. And one of the things they do is emit colors, and they're being used for next generation TV screens. Biotech. So 1953, Watson and Crick decode the structure of DNA. And we'll talk about that. There are 4 base pairs: adenine, thymine, guanine, and cytosine. And A and T can link, and G and C can link. And so we have 4 letters, 2 rules, 20 parts, which are the amino acids, can make all of life. Well, why don't we make other things that way? We're working on it. But playing with this life, J. Craig Venter beat the government to sequencing human DNA. We'll talk about what that means. And he said, we're worried about carbon in the atmosphere, carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. If we grow corn, it takes the carbon out of the atmosphere, and then you burn it in your car as ethanol, puts it back. We're not adding carbon because it came out of the atmosphere. But we can get 1,000 times as much fuel from algae that we can from corn. He's engineering, bioengineering that kind of algae. Spider silk is very strong. We can't synthesize it. The closest we get is nylon. But how do you get spider silk? Well, you can't breed spiders to get the spider web silk. It's thousands of times stronger than steel. But you take the DNA in the spider that makes the protein for the spider silk, put it in the DNA of a goat. You then, that protein shows up in the goat milk. You milk the goat, extract the protein, and make elevator cables that are far stronger than steel. Genomic fabrication, here we'll wind up. Again, all of life is manufactured by DNA. And we understand how it does it. At the same time, 1953, that Watson and Crick were decoding the structure of DNA, Johnny von Neumann at Princeton Institute for Advanced Studies and Stanislav Ohm, mathematician, were asking, could we make machines that reproduce themselves, self-replicating machines, self-replicating systems? And they work with cellular automata to do it. We'll explain what that is. So the whole point of this course is I'm just blasting through all these cool technologies. But week by week, as we go through the course, you're going to understand how they work. Well, there's something, a cellular automata called the game of life, is developed by Conway. And what you do is you take a grid and you color certain squares black, and you have a set of rules. What happens if you have two black squares? What happens in the next iteration to their neighbor? And from those rules, they developed something called a glider gun. And this arrangement, following the rules, is manufacturing these guys. Now, these are very simple, they're two-dimensional, and they're inside the computer. We make them complicated, and we make them three-dimensional, and we get them outside the computer into reality. If you wanted to make an oak tree, you would not stick a pole in the ground, nail sticks to the pole, and glue leaves to the stick. What would you do? Anybody? How do you make an oak tree?
With an acorn.
Right. Plant an acorn, let the stupid oak tree make itself. Oak trees aren't very bright, but they can make an oak tree. Our cell phones are so smart. Why do we have all these people with tweezers making them? Let the stupid things make themselves. That's what we're going to figure out how to do in this course. These things are manufacturing themselves. So I mentioned Robert Freitas and Ralph Merkel earlier, and I said, I've got this idea about this genomic manufacturing. What if I were to patent it? Turns out they've got the patents. I sent away for it or downloaded it. It's like a 100-page patent. But they have a book called Kinematic Self-Replicating Machines. They're working on how to do that. And also working on that is Stephen Wolfram. We'll talk about him a lot in this course. This is a form of cellular automata. And this pattern is generated from this set of rules. He wrote a book about how to do that. I had him lecture about it at Pratt, A New Kind of Science. And he said, I think when I find the code that generates our universe, it'll be about 6 lines. In other words, this kind of rules not only can make those little game of life dots, they make the whole universe. 6 lines of codes can make our whole universe. Well, for 20 years, he's been looking for it. He finally found it last June. And this is a book describing it. We'll talk about this later in the course. So these are IBM using self-assembly to make computer chips. When you start making these very tiny things, it's hard to get tweezers small enough to put 14 billion transistors on the size of your thumbnail. But if you have it do itself, it's a better way to do it. They're working on that. Person getting it into the real world is Neil Gershenfeld at Center for Bits and Atoms at MIT's Multimedia Lab. And he rejects the computer architecture of Turing and von Neumann and says, sorry, this slide got cut off, this caption got cut off, but what if the computation were done by the material itself? So if you think of Lego blocks, how you can assemble Lego blocks is in part determined by the Lego blocks. There are only certain ways they'll fit together. They're telling you how they can fit together by their shape. What if we use this for what he calls a fab lab? This is a fab lab. It can make anything. So suppose you're in the middle of nowhere in Africa. You want to make a bicycle. Well, you've got to have steel tubing. How do you get steel tubing? You need a steel mill. Well, a steel mill is pretty big and expensive. How do you make rubber? Well, you need a vulcanization facility. So you need all this stuff to make, or you could just 3D print a bicycle, skip the whole thing. So that's what he's working on. City of Barcelona is working on setting up the ability to 3D print all the stuff they need. We'll talk about how to do that. So some people thinking this way. Carl Shu used to teach at Pratt. I think he's at SciArc now. Gives his student 3 genes. By the end of the semester, the building has grown itself. So the 3 genes A, B, and C, there's rules for how they can arrange. And here's the building grew itself. I have a whole website about how this works, generativegenomics.com. And we'll talk about more people doing this. Winding up here, what is this stuff doing to us as human beings? So Marshall McLuhan in Understanding Media describes how these technologies are extensions of us. So we have all these neurons in our brain, but we put a telephone up to our ear and suddenly they're extended out into the telephone network. And so the phone network becomes part of our neurology, part of our biology, part of us. We'll talk about how that works and how these technologies change us. What are all these things doing to us? And McLuhan started by talking about TV. At that time in the 60s, well, color TV existed, but very few people had it. So color TV was black and white and fuzzy and 6 channels. What happens when it's color, high def, and used to be a commercial for a tech company. It showed a beat up, exhausted traveling salesman in a desert town holding his jacket, tie loosened, checking into a cheap motel. And there's a bored woman behind the desk checking him in, and he says, any food? She says, vending machine down the hall. He says, any entertainment? She says, every movie ever made in every language, 24/7. He says, what? We're almost there. Right now you have to get Hulu and Amazon Fire and Apple but all that's in flux. Pretty soon you'll just click on being able to get anything ever done. Now, we're going to talk about finally the movement from scarcity to abundance. In scarcity, and we have abundance, we just don't understand it. But in scarcity, the more you use, the less there is, the more degraded it is, the more expensive it is. So this is the Colorado River. Everybody's taking water out of the Colorado River and there's not much left. So if you take water out and you're upstream from me, there's less for me. But in abundance, the more you use, the more there is, the better it is, the cheaper it gets. This is Wikipedia. If all of us rush out to Wikipedia and download stuff after class, if I go to Wikipedia this evening, is there going to be less stuff there? If you go to everybody goes to the library, and I tell you, you go to the Pratt Library and take out 10 books. And the last person to get there, the books won't be there. That's scarcity. But if I tell you, go to Wikipedia and look up these 10 articles, the last person to get there, it'll still be there. And if some of you were improving the articles while you were downloading them, I don't post very much on Wikipedia, but I fix things when I see things are wrong. The last person to get there, it'll be better than the first person. What happens when the whole world is working by abundance rather than scarcity? Now, are things getting better? So we'll talk about this next week, but here's a hint. There's something called abject poverty. Abject poverty is less than $2 a day. So better than $2 a day is not great, but it's better than less. If we go back to 1820, 95% of the people in the world lived in abject poverty. The average person in 1820 was living on, you got to correct for inflation, but $2 a day. Life was really hard. If we go back to 1970, half the world was in abject poverty. But today, and this is already 5 years ago, only 10% of the world is in abject poverty. 90% of the world is doing better. Not great, but better. And this is already 5 years later, 6 years later. So from 1970 to today, have things been getting better? Well, the biggest story in the history of the human race just happened, and nobody talks about it. And that is 90% of the world exited abject poverty just in the past 40 years. It's the biggest story in the history of the world. Nobody talks about it. We'll talk about it a little bit in this course. So there's something going on that nobody's talking about. We'll try to talk about in this course. What happens when we Xerox our cars? We'll get to that. So let me get my cursor back. From here, laser pointer, stop sharing screen, review. So, any questions? Okay, nobody leave. I got to check off attendance. I got to make sure we didn't lose anybody.